again, and welcome to the Big Boss curve. This is the 5th example curve that we're going to be covering, and after this we'll be going into how to design your own curve. So, the Big Boss. It's the big, epic, momentous fight that your players have been anticipating for hopefully quite some time. This fight has 2 intensity peaks. It makes it very dynamic because there's also a fairly low intensity valley. And dynamism in a curve like this is really all about the differences between the peaks and valleys and how we get between them. This is going to feel like a longer and more intense fight. It's pacing because you've got a lot of things happening within a short period of time. That's the whole point of the peaks and valleys. Peaks represent things that feel like they're increasing in intensity. That's what the peak represents. That's what it is. So when you have more of those in the same space, the fight is more dynamic, and it feels like more events take place and is therefore faster paced. This fight also creates a very strong sense of narrative, not necessarily in the way that you describe things, although you can absolutely do that too, but it's more about the ebb and flow that happens as players experience this fight, since they go up and down and up and down, and there's a conclusion finally, and it feels like so much has occurred. You want to use this fight sparingly, mainly because if you do it too often, players start to get really tired because there's so much going on in each fight. A really dynamic curve requires a lot of sort of mental energy from your players and from you as the DM. But because of that, it really should be reserved for the big epic final confrontation or something similar. Now, if we look at this curve as compared to the mini-boss curve, there are a few very distinct differences. The first one is that you want to start higher than the mini-boss curve does, because players should be really starting from a sense of anticipating the fight, worried about it a little bit, feeling like it's going to be a pretty major encounter because, well, hopefully you've been building up your boss, and if you have been, then they should be anticipating that fight, and you should have made it pretty clear, like, this is not going to be an easy fight. So at this point in the stage, the players are going to be thinking, okay, we're about to go into this fight. It's a tough fight. We're gonna have a hard time. It's going to be a tough fight to accomplish. Then, you want to rise quickly into the first peak. At this point, the player should be feeling like, yeah, okay, this thing is pretty terrifying. We started the fight, we were worried already, and now that we're fighting it, it seems like our fears were warranted. This thing is pretty tough. Then you want to start to de-escalate. And the reason you want to start to de-escalate is because you want the players to start feeling like, okay, we can handle this. It's tough, but it's reasonable. We can do this. We can do this. Then you start to build up the intensity again. The second time that you start to build the intensity, hitherto unknown abilities might come out, or maybe players start to run low on their big resources, or they start to hit something with something that they were really relying on, and it turns out it's just not very effective. At this point, the players think, this is going to be harder than we thought. And then you start to reach the larger peak, the second peak, the major peak that defines the feeling of the boss fight in context of the previous valley. We have a moment when the enemy comes up with some grand move, some amazing spell, some huge ability, some surprise reinforcements, something along those lines that really put this at the top of the intensity that it's going to be for the whole fight. This is the top point of the fight, and at this point the players feel like we are going to die. This is the point when the players feel absolutely out of their depth, right before they start to get a handle on the fight again, and it begins to decline. The de-escalation should be something like, did we win? We just won. Oh, we won. Sweet victory. That sort of thing. People should be very, very thrilled. And that moment of like, wait, is it over? Is actually really valuable here, because you just made it feel like the fight is insurmountable. And by making the fight feel like it's insurmountable just for a moment, for just a second, players don't have time to get frustrated like they would maybe in an against the wall curve. But having overcome that, they don't really feel powerful, but they do also. They feel accomplished, certainly. They did it. They took down the big bad. This is the fight for that moment. First, never constrain these fights to a specific number of rounds. Even though a lot of the videos so far have said, yeah, 3 to 5 rounds is probably right for this curve, really, those are just sort of estimates. What you really need to be thinking about is, what is the minimum number of rounds that I need to achieve this curve, to create this player experience? That's what you need to be doing. So for example, here's what this curve looks like over a 10-round combat. Notice, the curve is identical. It's just a matter of at what point the peaks and valleys occur, because now we're talking about, well, it takes longer to get this peak maybe, and I want to do it over 2 or 3 rounds, so that's what I'm gonna do. You can totally do that. Now, 10 rounds is obviously pretty extreme for a D&D combat. Not that you should never ever do a 10-round combat, just that in general, it's definitely on the longer side. But the point is, you can really just map the curve to any number of rounds you think you can accomplish it. What really comes down to is, does the curve match with the rounds in the sense that you can actually achieve that curve in those rounds? Like if you tried to shove this into 1 round, you could do that too, but it probably wouldn't work very well. Next, you should consider each round carefully. With this curve more than any other curve, the round-to-round combat matters a lot, because you really need to capture that sense of dynamic combat, where things are rising and falling and ebbing and flowing. Things are going back and forth. That's what creates the pacing. So, you really want to look into how each round plays out. A round when certain things happen. Layer actions, for example, are a good thing to employ here, because layer actions often fall on specific turn orders and only happen on specific rounds. The problem with that is if you do a layer action that's really powerful, that's enough to really push that curve up so that the intensity starts to peak, you end up with a situation where you might be doing too much on one turn that makes players sort of start to fall too quickly. The reason a big scary thing with just layer actions probably isn't gonna work is because A, really strong layer actions have the potential to start really wiping the party too fast, and B, weaker layer actions really just help contribute to an increase in intensity, but they don't really do it by themselves. So you usually want to use layer actions in conjunction with other abilities and figure out how those things sort of synergize with one another to create the curves. An example of that might be something like, if rocks are falling in the lair in a cave, then maybe the rocks start to block off the entrance and the players have to make a decision about whether to run or stay, but this is their big moment. And if they run, you can drop the curve off there, you keep your big boss, and you can pull it back later if you want. Or you can have the front just completely cave in, and now the players are trapped in there, and that can really raise the stakes, because now, even if they weren't considering running, the option is gone, and also the option for reinforcements is gone. If you've used the against the wall to set up the boss, then in that one, you might have used a Deus Ex Machina to get an NPC in there to keep the players safe. But now that it's caved off, you know that because it's caved in, that NPC can't get to you, and the stakes go up. So things like that are nice, because then on top of that, the enemy starts to reveal, oh, also, I can do these other abilities that I haven't used before. Isn't that fun? And now the abilities are like starting to really mess with the players, and they're really worried, and they're on their own, and they're against this really tough thing, and that's how you can get this really nice high second peak. Our example for this is going to be the iconic dragon. We're gonna modify the dragon though. We're gonna make it better fit this curve. An ancient dragon, even by itself, probably not that great at accomplishing this curve. Even with layer actions, it's gonna be tough, but with a little bit of tweaking, we can definitely get there. So, remember this? You start out with, okay, this is gonna be scary. Yeah, because it's a dragon, and people should know what a dragon is capable roughly. And if they don't, you can set it up ahead of time. As long as that's sort of established, people are gonna go into this fight thinking, okay, we're about to fight a dragon, this is gonna be tough. Now we have the, yeah, this is pretty scary as we get that first intensity peak. And the, yeah, this is pretty scary thing is like, maybe the legendary actions start to come in, and you start to rise that intensity pretty quickly over the course of that first round, and then the breath weapon hits. And the breath weapon is the first peak. Now the breath weapon is the first peak and not the second peak for 2 reasons. 1, because it's a recharge ability, and the players hopefully know that it's a recharge ability, then rolling to recharge the ability has the effect of having these little spikes in intensity that help to sort of ramp up later as you go. But also, there's a drop in intensity if it ramps up and then they fail to recharge their breath ability. So it helps contribute to that sort of like rise and fall feel. And you have these little mini curves as you go to really make that fight feel really dynamic and really eventful. But the reason that you want to hit the breath attack first is because the players are probably ready for it. And if the players are ready for it and it lands and it doesn't do that much because they have resistances or they made their saves or maybe they have spells to mitigate the damage, maybe they have, maybe they put up a bunch of fire resist spells, whatever, that breath attack comes out and it's still scary. It's still a scary ability, but it hits and then it ends and they're okay. And the players start to feel like, okay, the worst of it is over. That's how you want them to feel right now. But if you waited till later, then when the players feel like, okay, the worst of it is over, you're not going to have that huge spike in intensity followed by a really satisfying conclusion and resolution to the fight, because they're going to feel like, oh, we got the breath weapon, no problem, we're good to go. And you don't want them to feel like they have a handle on the fight throughout the whole fight. So you give them the breath weapon, which makes them feel like they have a handle on the fight, which lets the intensity start to drop. And then, as the intensity drops, the dragon starts to show that it has a few more tricks up its sleeve, and that's when the intensity can start to rise again, and then it peaks. Now, in this valley, you have the, okay, it's scary, but we can do this, and that's like post-breath weapon. Also, if they're starting to get good hits in here, then they're going to start to really feel like, yeah, you know what, we're chipping away at it, we survived its breath weapon, I think we're going to be okay. That's the valley. Remember, it's scary, but we can do this. Then the oh no, it's going to be harder than we thought is this rise in intensity here. And again, we're going back into legendary actions. Layer actions can help here. But what we're going to do in this example is give the dragon a few spells. And this is when the dragon reveals that it has spells. And that's going to really contribute to ramping up that intensity. We're going to show that it has spells, but we're not going to cast any big spells yet. But, of course, the stronger the spells, the faster the intensity is going to ramp up. And we want this to ramp up over about 2 rounds. So we're going to keep it somewhat moderate, but then we want to spike it right at the end. And the reason we want to spike it right at the end is because this is the point when we want the players to feel like, oh no, we are going to die. And that's when the dragon reveals, I also have 7th level spells, or whatever level spell is appropriate. Be very careful about your spell choice here, but also make sure it's enough to be pretty terrifying to the players. So a good example for something like this might be Counterspell. They start to feel like they have the handle on the fight, and then as you're shifting from the valley to the second peak, what you can do is you can have the dragon cast something like Counterspell. That's a great example of a spell that would work really well here, because it's the kind of thing that shows the players you don't have as much control over this fight as you thought. And then, as you ramp into it with all of your other tools, the fight starts to feel really scary again. And that's how you can make that second peak overtake the first one in intensity. And that's really what we're after. But then, of course, with some clever usage of counterspells of their own, the fact that the dragon spells are probably pretty limited, and the fact that they have a pretty good handle on everything else, this is when the ramping down point starts, and then you approach the resolution, and at the very end, the dragon finally falls over, and the players are just like, did we kill it? It's dead? We did it! We did it! And they feel really great, and they rejoice. Be ready for your players to rejoice. If you've pulled this off correctly, your players are going to be ecstatic. And you don't even need narrative elements. The feeling of achievement, of success, of satisfaction, really comes from the design itself, the game design. You aren't relying on narration to get those emotions. They help. They help sort of extend it. They help accentuate it. But the core of it is the game design. So even if you just take the token off or knock over the mini, or if you're on roll 20, you add the little X to show that it's dead, and everyone's like, oh, it's dead? And then they're all like super excited. You don't even need a crazy narrative moment. And when you do the crazy narrative moment, that really makes that moment feel really, really impactful, but it's the game design that makes it feel impactful, not your incredible narration. Remember, with this curve, you need to start pretty high because of the anticipation. You need to spike once early. You hit that first peak, which is somewhat tough. You sort of validate the player's anticipation, their anxiety, their nerves going into this fight. But then things start to settle down as players get a handle on the fight, but then the real fight begins. But then they get a handle on that, and it resolves, and they feel amazing. Finally, some things to consider. The dragon having magic would have to be something that you set up, narratively. Because, or mechanically, they could have fought another dragon with magic. The reason that's important is because they need to be able to anticipate that the dragon might have magic, and then the reveal that it does in fact have magic isn't a completely out of the blue twist. It's, oh no, it's got spells. And then you start to show them what it's capable of. Remember to design for individual rounds because the dynamics of this fight and the pacing of this fight are very important. Much more so than other curves, this fight relies heavily on the pacing to make it feel really impactful and really eventful. Curve like this is very difficult to make also if you use maximum crit rules, because maximum crit rules really throw these curves out of alignment. When players crit 2 or 3 times in a fight, which can happen even though it's statistically not the most likely possible thing, and you're using maximum damage, you have to do a lot more adjusting of enemy HP and stuff on the fly to make sure that they don't just destroy it. And that's something that you should always be very careful about. What things you adjust on the fly in order to help this curve sort of unfold. You want to make sure that the player actions and player behaviors are absolutely being rewarded in a straight cause and effect kind of way. But you also want to make sure that the curve unfolds. So you need to sort of really balance those things, and it can be tricky. There's a lot of improvisation that has to happen in order to make these curves happen. But if you pull it off, I promise you, the results are so worth it. So, good luck, and as always, let me know how it goes. I'll see you next time. Okay, bye.